Hello and welcome to another Smaulgld live stream. Today we're doing a special morning edition, Wednesday the 28th of August 2019. Today's topic is the Fed really the enemy? Dudley provides another clue. The reason we're doing this is a couple of episodes back we asked, is the Fed the enemy? Today's events provide a clue. And we discussed how Donald Trump went on a rampage that he was preparing to take some action against China, while at the same time Fed Chairman Jerome Powell was off in Jackson Hole giving a speech explaining what he was going to do, what the Fed was going to do about the economy. And Trump noted astutely that Powell is making monetary policy without really even knowing what's going on in the country, and he could be making policy that doesn't align unwittingly with U.S. policy or U.S. foreign policy, U.S. domestic policy, whatever it might be, that the Fed's so-called independence means that they could be doing things that could be not in the interest of the United States, but in the interest of what they believe is in the interest of the United States, or worse, what they believe is in the interest of the banking system, their banking friends, or whomever, whatever special interest. Because the Fed is not, it does not have the same checks and balances that other branches of government have, because they are independent. They are not a branch of the Treasury. Now, most countries have a central bank, if they have a central bank, and it is run by the Treasury. It's a part of the government, and therefore it's responsible and responsive to the people. Now, a lot of people think that's great, and it'd be great if we can get rid of the Fed. The problem with any central bank, if it's not controlled properly, is politicians are just as likely, if not more so, to act in a very loose monetary way and print money and make promises and then direct their Treasury to pay for them. So it's not like if you get rid of the Fed, you're going to have sound monetary policy. However, what you will have is, I guess, the Fed or the central bank you deserve, because people will always vote for, Mises made this point, will always vote for looser money. We had this issue. The issue of the Fed is a bipartisan one. It is not a Trump versus the Democrats, although whatever Trump is for now or whatever he's against now, the Democrats take the opposite stance. But back in the late 70s, when Jimmy Carter was approached by his Fed chair at the time and to raise interest rates in order to break the back of inflation, Paul Volcker was his name, Carter went along with it, but it was a political price to pay, because that meant mortgage rates went higher and it caused a recession. Ronald Reagan kept Volcker in with the same policies. Now, eventually those policies worked and the inflation broke and we had the 80s boom. But during that time period, there were a lot of very angry people. Building companies would send bricks to the Federal Reserve. So if it was up to the popular will of the people, they would have ended or not even allowed without any persuading to the contrary, they wouldn't have gone for 18%, 19% federal fund rates, which really made it very prohibitive to borrow and did bring economic activity to a slow crawl. However, it did end the inflationary period, so it was the dose that perhaps was needed. So the point being there is not to replay the 70s inflation era and Carter and Reagan and Paul Volcker and monetary policy of that era, but to point out that the people do not necessarily agree with, nor do the politicians necessarily agree with the Federal Reserve, and there's really not much they can do about it. Now, in the case of Volcker and Carter, they did agree to this. Volcker went to Carter, but if Volcker wanted to do it on his own and just raise interest rates, saying this is what we got to do, really there was nothing stopping him from doing that. And Greenspan mentioned on numerous occasions since he's been in retirement that the Fed really answers to nobody. Now, we talked about how Jerome Powell is off on his own, basically conducting monetary policy with an eye towards what Trump might be doing in foreign policy, but really not working in conjunction with, as a central bank that's part of the Treasury might be doing. But yesterday, we got a even greater example or clue as to how dangerous or how perhaps out of sync a independent Federal Reserve can be with the United States, because Dudley is a former Fed chair. Now, he doesn't make policy. He's out of business right now. But his thinking, he was the New York Fed president, and the New York Fed is the main, the number one Fed branch in the Federal Reserve System. And he wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal essentially saying that we need to conduct our policy in a way that, how do I put this, could stop Trump if we think he's going off on a frolic and detour that he shouldn't, that could essentially be harming or damaging to the United States or damaging to our interests, damaging to the international monetary stability. And the problem with that is, many of you know that economics is not a science. In fact, I think Keynes or somebody called it the dismal science. You really cannot prove with any specificity that if X happens, Y happens. Just like, for example, now we're going through this whole, the yield curve is inverted, and 48 out of 49 times it signifies a recession in 6 to 24 months. Okay, that's not really a precise indicator. You can argue that maybe there's not a causation, correlation. You really can't say with any specificity that anyone in particular's monetary policy is the correct one. But yet, that doesn't stop the Federal Reserve people from acting like they actually know. And when you get those circumstances where you have people acting as if they know, you get this arrogance that they're going to do what they're going to do, if especially they have the independence where nobody is going to stop them from doing what they want to do. So, Dudley writes in the Bloomberg, the Fed shouldn't enable Donald Trump. Now, think about that. If that's not treasonous in the sense that if Congress, if Nancy Pelosi says that fiscal policy shouldn't enable Trump, well, she'd be absolutely within her rights to say, as Congress, as the holders of the purse strings, we should not finance, because they're in charge of the fiscal policy, Donald Trump's decision to spend money here or there. And that's fine. That's part of the checks and balances. But for the Fed to say, we should not enable Trump's policies, the question is, who are they and who are they beholden to? He says the central bank should refuse to play along with an economic disaster in the making. Now, this is clearly an opinion. He doesn't know. No one knows what the outcome of Donald Trump's policies with China may be. That's like saying if we start a war, we're going to lose. You don't know that. There's no factual circumstance where Dudley can say what Trump is doing could end a disaster. There's too many unvariables. That's the whole purpose and not the whole purpose, but the whole criticism of central planning of the economies there's just too many variables in the free market, and even with the free market with intervention, to figure out and to know with any precise determination what's going to happen in the economy. So he's already starting on the idea that what Trump is doing is bad. Okay? He knows what Trump is doing is bad. And now he's going one step further. It'd be one thing for him to say, I'm a private citizen, and I used to work at the Fed, and here's why Trump's policies are bad. And he can throw out formulas. He can explain why tariffs are bad in general, tariffs are bad specifically. He can put out all types of formulas about what might happen if these tariffs continue. He can do out A-B scenarios. There's nothing wrong with that. But what he's done is, rather than explain himself in great detail, he just makes sweeping statements about what's going to happen, but then he makes so here's what he says. It says the Trump's trade war with China keeps undermining the confidence of businesses and consumers. Okay. Well, first of all, that's not even factual. That could be true. It depends on how you measure it. It could also be 100% true no matter how you measure it. But then the question is, how long does that consumer confidence and business confidence remain low? What impact does that have on the economy? How long will it remain low? What if it rebounds? Again, these are questions that there are no specific answers to. But again, in economics, you have to make your statements and you have to make your assumptions. So he then says the manufacturer disaster in the making presents the Federal Reserve with a dilemma. So he's already concluded that whatever Trump is doing is a disaster, economic disaster, 101. It's going to happen. Should it mitigate the damage by providing offsetting stimulus or refuse to play along? Now, the answer to that question already presupposes that the Fed has the power to do something, and it does. So his point is, look, if what the president is doing is going to cause a disaster or an economic slowdown, well, if you're on side with the government, you would say, well, we can't allow that to happen, so we're going to have to provide monetary stimulus to offset this trade war. Or the alternative is, why should we play along with this guy who we don't agree with, who we think is causing a disaster? In a sense, we would be enabling. But you can see right here, their dilemma is one that they shouldn't have. They shouldn't have this dilemma whether to go along with the administration or not, in my opinion. Because if they were part of the administration, the central bank or the Treasury would be part and parcel responsible for whatever the outcome is with the trade war with China. So let's say if we had a central bank, which was the United States Central Bank, not the Federal Reserve private central bank. It wasn't independent. It was appointed by Trump and with the advice and consent of the Senate, the officers of that national bank. They'd be doing a policy right now which would what China is doing in conjunction, whatever they want to do in terms of the trade war, they can align their monetary policy with their national goals. What the Fed is saying, if we don't agree with the national goals, or we think their national goals will be harmful to the United States, to the world, to whomever, we don't have to play along. And he's absolutely right. The way the Fed is set up, absolutely do not have to follow along. And then he makes the point that the Fed monetary policy makers typically take what happens outside the realm as a given. Of course, because they're not part of anything. They're only conducting monetary policy. And yet, another problem with the Fed is they have this dual mandate where they're somehow responsible for full employment. Why? There's only so much they can do. They don't hire people, so they can move interest rates up and down, and that's going to somehow make you responsible for full employment. There's other things that can be done. I mean, the Congress could, not that I'm in favor of government spending to create jobs, but they're in a much better position for to create full employment. They can actually allocate money and give people jobs. So that's the other issue with the Fed is what is its mandate? And it seems that their mandate is very broad because if their mandate also includes full employment, they can say, hey, what Trump is going to do is going to cost us jobs. Now, again, that's not factual. That could be true. Maybe it isn't true. But if they decide it could be true, they can implement policies which could harm Trump's negotiating position vis-a-vis China. Then he says, according to conventional wisdom, if Trump's trade war hurts the U.S. economic outlook, the Fed should respond by adjusting monetary policy accordingly. You would think, in this case, cutting interest rates. That's what you would expect. If they assumed that what he's doing is going to harm U.S. economic outlook. It might help U.S. economic outlook. Again, they have two issues here. They're making their own assumptions, their own conclusions, and then they get to act in accordance with their view on what they think is going to happen. And it could be what they're going to do is going to hurt the United States. And then it says that Chairman Powell, this is Dudley writing, has hinted he's aware of the problem. And he noted that monetary policy cannot provide a settled rule book for international trade. That's right. Bingo star. That's not what the Fed does. They play around with interest rates. They meet. Now they discuss what assets they may buy. But again, he realizes that the Fed is kind of in a box, and they should be. But maybe that box should be not controlled by them, but should be on the other side, should be in the Treasury, so that the executive branch can control what goes on there. He goes on to say, I understand and support Fed officials' desire to remain apolitical. Which, I mean, if you're going to be independent, if that's like your vaunted raison d'être, that's why you're there, is you're supposed to look at things just from the economic point of view for stable prices and full employment, then you're supposed to remain apolitical. But then he says, but Trump's ongoing attacks on Powell, now this is taking it personal, this is strictly business, this is personal, not business here, and on the institution have made that untenable. So now he's got his dander up, and he is saying, hey, you come after us, we come after you. And so he says central bank officials face a choice: enable the Trump administration or continue down a disastrous path of trade war escalation. Again, he's making the judgment that what Trump is doing, and some may agree that this is going to be a disaster, but it's not a fact. It is not a fact, and it is a political decision. It's an economic decision that I would say is not the Fed's to make. If you have this democratic republic and the president has these powers, then Congress can try to stop him. I don't have a problem with that. Even the courts, I have a bit more of a problem with that depending on how they try to stop him. Or send a clear signal that if the administration does so, the president, not the Fed, will bear the risks, including the risk of losing the next election. Well, that is how it should work. But what he's saying is, there's even an argument that the election itself falls within the Fed's purview. Wrong goes star. See, now he's saying the Fed should grab more power. After all, Trump's election, at least he says, arguably presents a threat to the U.S. and global economy. Well, arguably, it presents a boom to the economy. Maybe not to the global economy, maybe to the global economy and to the U.S. economy. Then it says it also presents a threat to the Fed's independence and its ability to achieve its employment and inflation objectives. Now he sounds like Hal in 2001 Space Odyssey. Because Trump is saying, well, he's realizing that the Fed is a threat. He's saying, I'm afraid I can't lower those interest rates, Donald. I'm sorry, I can't lower those rates. Because he realizes that if they lower rates, they're no longer independent because they're just acting on behalf of Donald Trump. So he then says, he concludes, if the goal of monetary policy is to achieve the best long-term economic outcome, then Fed officials should consider how their decisions will affect the political outcome in 2020. So essentially he's saying that the Fed not only is in charge of, because Congress gave him these powers, stable prices and full employment, but who should be president based on whether that president is a threat to the global economy and to the Fed itself. This is like Blade Runner here. That's not their job, but a lot of people seem to think that somehow because the Fed is... Most people don't even understand what it is. They think, I've read many people say, oh, it's part of the checks and balances. There is no checks and balance. There are no checks and balances with the Fed. The Fed is an independent central bank. And we've seen now two examples where the Fed could unwittingly be working at cross purposes to national goals. Or worse, as Dudley suggests, working against the government. All right. Let's see what we got here. Any comments? Tonight we're going to do What About Platinum? So set your calendars. I'm going to put out a notice around 7 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. I put out a notice about if anyone wanted an update on platinum. And I got a response on the poll that I did on YouTube. About 50-50. A lot of people didn't want to hear about it. But I'm going to do it anyway. We're going to do it tonight. The price of platinum is on the move today, and I think at least for the 50% who want to hear about platinum, I'm going to give you an overview. So tonight at 7. All right, what do we got here? Shlomo is here. Hello. Avril Blackwig. In my humble opinion, politics, trade wars aside, the real issue for the Fed is to address excessive federal spending in relation to our real GDP. Yeah, but the Fed can't really address that. See, this is why it gets tricky. The Fed spends money into deficit knowing that it's going to sell bonds. The Fed has nothing to do with that. The only time the Fed actually enables spending by Congress is by monetizing debt, meaning they buy the bonds. But they're not doing that now. So the Fed really can't address the federal spending, nor should they. Addressing federal spending under the way the U.S. Constitution is set up is a function of Congress. They're the ones who set the budget. And it's also a function of the president, because he should veto bills if they really want to control excessive federal spending. Congress would put together a balanced budget, and if they didn't, they'd send it to the president, and the president would veto it. The Fed's got nothing to do with that, though. To curb these tendencies to annually raise debt ceilings. Yeah, but the Fed's got nothing to do with the debt ceiling. That is Congress being irresponsible, raising debt ceilings, and not producing rational budgets, which result in bullying of the Fed to cut rates, provide liquidity to fund all that additional debt. Yeah, but you see, if the Fed didn't exist or was part of the Treasury, we'd still have this problem, because all politicians, no matter what branch of government they're in, are always going to make promises they can't keep unless they spend money. So I'm not suggesting that to end the Fed and then that putting the monetary policy in the hands of politicians is going to be a good thing. I'm just suggesting it's more in line with the nature of a democratic republic. That why should 12 angry men at the Fed, or women, or whomever, make decisions with no consequence, that somehow they're independent? I mean, if you think about what they did, they bailed out the banks. I don't think that elected officials would have bailed out the banks. They might have handed money out to the people. I'm not saying that's a better idea, but the point is that an independent Fed means that it can actually become like HAL in 2001 Space Odyssey and go rogue and just say, well, we think you elected somebody who's a threat and we're going to stop him. No, that's the job of Congress to stop him, or that's the job of the electorate to stop him next time, not of the Fed. All right, everyone. Well, we don't have a lot of comments today, but of course, this was on very short notice. So I want to thank everyone for joining me today, and we will see you this evening. Have a good day.